After 2 months of some kind of stay-at-home order, after 2 months of grappling with this pandemic, lately I found myself saying the following: I'm so ready for this to be over. I'm so ready to get back to normal. I've been hearing it from others too. Some of you here may have even said it. This desire to leave all this behind, it isn't necessarily bad, but there's a risk. What is the risk? The risk is that we leave this time behind too quickly and miss the grace that God is giving us. Remember our homily series, Wounded. God permits suffering. He permits pandemics for a purpose. The risk is that we miss that purpose. We miss the promise that quarantine holds for us. The promise of quarantine. Individually, we've become aware of stuff during this time, not able to distract ourselves with activity, with work, with excessive socializing. We've encountered mess that's probably been with us for a while. In our marriages, our families, we've become aware that some of our priorities, some of our values are a little off. The same is true for our communities, our society, whether it be the way, the extent to which we spend time with our extended families, the way, the extent we spend time with people in our neighborhood, the way that youth sports can sometimes be the tail that wags the dog, the way that we find our primary worth in work. During this time of where we've become all sorts of things, and we've begun to ask questions about the way we usually go about life. On this feast of the Ascension, God has one word for us: wait. Don't move on too quickly. Wait for the promise of the Father. Wait for the promise of quarantine. Let's dive into our readings into this feast and see what more God has to say about waiting. In our first reading, the Lord offers us 3 insights. 2 come from the very first verse. It begins in the first book. These might seem like a throwaway line, insignificant. But what is Luke saying? Acts is not the first book. It's the second act, if you will. Luke writes his gospel, that's the beginning. But it isn't the end. There's something more. In that same verse, we find our second insight. We don't hear it in today's reading, but in the literal Greek, it says, I dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. Not with all that he did and taught, but with all he began to do and teach. Again, you might say that doesn't sound like the biggest of deals, Father, but it is. Jesus begins to do and to teach in the Gospel of Luke, and he continues to do and to teach in Acts, even and especially after the Ascension. Acts is the second book, the second act. In it, Jesus continues the doing and the teaching that he began in the Gospel. Final insight from today's first reading. Just before he ascends into heaven, Christ has these words for the apostles: I enjoin you not to depart from Jerusalem. Rather, wait for the promise of the Father. Jesus spent 40 days with his apostles after the resurrection. He's ascending into heaven, and he wants to be clear about one thing. Don't move too quickly. Wait. Sit with everything that has happened. If you move too quickly, you will miss the promise of the Father. It is God's will for the apostles to wait. It's his will that they not move too quickly. I've got another book for you, God says. I've got a second act for you. I will continue my doing and my teaching through you. The same is true for us during quarantine. The first book, the first act, may be coming to an end, but there's a second one. What Jesus began in your life during quarantine, what he began in your family's life during quarantine, what he began in your marriage during quarantine, he longs to continue. And he enjoins you not to leave quarantine behind too quickly, but to wait for quarantine's promise. I sent an email earlier this week to a priest at the central office of the diocese. I offered some ideas about how the diocese can help priests do what I'm encouraging all of us to do. In quarantine, I encountered a number of different struggles. The struggle of loneliness, the struggle of envy, looking left and right at what other parishes are doing, feeling like I have to compete with them. The struggle of obedience to the bishop. The struggle of being separated from the normal acts of ministry. The struggle of being separated from you. In each of these, God has a grace for me. If I move too quickly, I leave those graces behind, and quarantine will have been for nothing. What do you do with all of this? Well, as Providence would have it, the church is liturgically in a period of waiting right now. It's called the Pentecost Novena. 9 weeks of prayer that began on Friday and conclude next Saturday. In an email this evening, you'll get a link to that prayer. We've been posting it daily at 9:30 a.m. on our Facebook page. What do you do with all this? Engage in that prayer. As individuals, as families, wait for the promise of the Father. Wait for the promise of quarantine. And in the midst of that novena, ask yourself, God, what is the promise of quarantine for me? What's the promise of quarantine for my marriage? What's the promise of quarantine for my family, for my children, for our community, for our parish family? We may hesitate to ask those questions because we know that the answers are going to require change. In quarantine, the change was forced upon us. We didn't willingly adopt it. We may have never surrendered our will to it. And so going back to normal, we've got to say yes to that which was imposed. Imagine not going back to normal, but instead living the new life that God offers us, embracing and living the promise of quarantine. My brothers and sisters, it's time for the second book. It's time for Jesus to continue the work that he has begun. It's time for us to slow down and linger a bit, to remain and to wait